if I'm not projecting enough, just let me know. This is why Lauren's such a fantastic advisor, because you go into her office and she says, here's the thing you're trying to say. You're like, yes, that's exactly the thing that I was trying to say. She already did the better version of the talk that I'm going to give you. But thank you. Thank you, Kristen Schultz, and Linda Zerilli, and Gina Olson, and Tate Brazas, and the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality. I received my PhD here in 2011 in political science under extraordinary intellectual mentorship of Lauren Berlant. Thank you always and forever for teaching me how to think and teaching me how to teach. Patchen Markell, Bernard Harcourt, and so many others, Nathan Targoff, Kathy Cohen, Julie Cooper, Jennifer Pitts, Linda Zerilli, Lisa Badine, Marianne Case, and Martha Nussbaum. And I realize it's a laundry list, but I mean, thinking of this talk, I just thought of how extraordinarily privileged I was to have such a brilliant community of scholars supporting and buoying me. And Nussbaum, whose work, as you'll see momentarily, infuses this talk throughout. Unlike many graduate students here, and I want to acknowledge this is not a facilitated place for everyone. My time here was pretty much fantastic. So I benefited from the stunningly smart council of advisors and friends. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me back on this beautiful, warm spring afternoon. And thanks to all of you for coming out today. So this is my talk, Kink and Football, Consent and Dignity. So this is how I should give a warning. This is not a trigger warning, so you have to stay. You can't leave. I mean, you can leave if you want. But it's just a warning, right? Like you've come to a talk called Kink, whatever it's called, and there's going to be graphic descriptions of sex and sexual violence and violence. And I don't say that glibly, I just say that. Okay. So this is the German cannibal case that opens the chapter of the book that I'm speaking on, also my talk today. So in the early 2000s, this guy Armin Muse in Germany went online to find someone who he wanted to have sex with, consume, eat, and kill. Bernd Brands readily answered the call and said he would like to be consumed and killed, and so Bernd Brands came over to his house and they had sex, and then Muse tried to chew his penis off, but it didn't come off, so then he cut it off, and then they fried it and they tried to eat it, but it was too... This is the descriptive graphic stuff that I was talking about. So then it was like charred, so they fed it to the dog. Okay. Oh, and then he put him in a bath. Brands kind of bled out in the bath, and then he stabbed him, cut him up into a bunch of parts, stored him in all over the yard, and then regularly sort of dined on his parts with wine. And then so then it was exposed. There was a police tip-off, and the higher court said no, consent does not mitigate your culpability to death. So it was homicide, and now he's in prison. So why am I telling you this story? Especially since, as I argue in my first book, as do others, scandalous sex cases makes for panic thinking about sex, right? Hastily made laws that exacerbate rather than eradicate sexual violence. Except here, dramatization accentuates the point. Consent is resolutely insufficient for imagining sexual justice and crafting sexual politics. So, yeah, resolutely insufficient. As I will adumbrate here and elaborate later, the German cannibal case presents a serious problem for BDSM and Kink practitioners and advocates whose moral come political square one is consent. This is no longer, maybe I'll use okay, I'll just use my here. Okay, so right, this is a very small sample of the larger sort of consent fetish among the fetishists. So Carol Schiskatz, practitioner advocate of BDSM, and this is from this old anthology in the early 90s on leather and kink. Right, it has nothing to do with violence, consensual sadomasochism, about safely enacting sexual fantasies with the consenting partner, emphases hers. Violence is the epitome of non-consensuality. This is the major lobbying group, the sort of kink lobbying group. I mean, it's not that major, so it's a kink lobbying group. But, and they've been appealing to the model penal code, which I'll talk about later, has been subject to a whole bunch of revisions and controversial revisions, and they're trying, the NCSF would like to make a kind of kink exemption to say, right, it's all about consent. The law should reflect that. But I think as the German cannibal case attests, we run into this problem with consent about its efficiency, which is one of three criticisms I level in the forthcoming book, subtly titled "Screw Consent." So there's the cover. It's a little shameless. So 3 criticisms I level at what I call the consent paradigm of sex law and sexual politics. So I'll outline the rest of the talk for you. Now, this comes out in December. I'm sure you can pre-order it before then, so you should do that. So the plan of action. So I'm going to talk about my first book for a moment, not only for self-aggrandizing purposes, but because it helps contextualize and clarify the arguments and stakes of screw consent in my talk now. I'll then chart the 3 criticisms leveled against consent across the 4 chapters of screw consent. I'll come back to the German cannibal case in order to thoroughly trouble consent as an ethical guarantor for sex, kinky sex, and American football. Okay, and I'll end with a dignity a coda on dignity. Before the tidal wave of the semester capsized upon me, I thought this coda was going to be the meat of the talk, but that was foolishly ambitious. So today you'll get a flavor for that talk that is not written. Oh no, that's my ugly book. Wait, hold on a second. Okay. It's a very preliminary, the coda, it's a very preliminary investigation into the political and moral pluripotence of dignity. This is sort of what I'm giving to you, sort of a report on a reconnaissance mission of the dignity literature for an article, and this is, so I'm moving from sort of project to wherever to an article that I'm writing with Claire McKinney, who's now a professor at William & Mary, and she also got a PhD in political science here, titled Capability Without Dignity, which will critically but generously engage Nussbaum's capabilities approach. I keep losing my mouse, okay. All right, so the first book. So here's the other. So just like I will acknowledge that this cover is terribly ugly, and I'm slightly embarrassed about it. I don't know why these lines are here, whatever. Okay, so that's so the second book. I was like, this first book was ugly, and the editor was like, yeah, that first book is totally ugly. All right. So so the question of that book is, what if our national sexuality is no longer heterosexuality but adult consensuality? That's a lot of syllables. What if our national sexuality is no longer heterosexuality, but adult consensuality? If this is true, what kind of problem would that pose, and for whom? Surveying case law, statutes, feminist and liberal legal theory, television and film, I argue that consent churns out figures for its own normativity: the recidivistic sex offender, the innocent child, and the consenting adult, prototyped as the heroic homosexual. And so I'm flying through this. Sex and Harm, the book, makes the case that vulnerability, autonomy, and the shiny new word, well, not new word, but renovated word, peremption, ought to supplement innocence, consent, and predation as our organizing terms for remedying and also remediating sexual violence. And I'll give another shout out to, especially to Lauren and to Patchen, because this book would not exist without them. It was the dissertation. Okay. So for my purposes today, the point here is that the consent criticisms are twofold, right? That it's moralized, turns out figures for its own normativity, and over-inclusive. And here I mean more or less categorical disqualifications based on age, right? So when you have an age of, in 12 states, there's a kind of blanket age of consent, which is 18 or 17, right? So you can have kind of that it can be over-inclusive, right? So denying young people sexual autonomy. Also over-inclusive, you can think of that idiom in terms of people with disabilities, right? So there are, states have clauses about, so often the language is mentally defective, right? People are kind of classed out of being able to consent to sexual relations, which denies, or can deny people with disabilities sex. So if if moralization and over-inclusiveness are the governing criticism of the book, the central criticism of the next book is that it consents under-inclusive. It doesn't do enough. And I think through idioms of insufficiency, inappositeness, $5 word, and scope. So 3 criticisms: insufficiency, inappositeness, and scope. So the first 2 chapters look at the insufficiency of consent. And I'll talk about the first one today. There's this kitschy little slide where I'll talk about the first one today. Okay. So insufficiency with regard to conduct, which is, does consent greenlight everything? And that's sort of what I'm talking about. That's the talk today. So that's insufficiency as regard to sexual conduct. The second one is insufficiency with regard to status. So there's certain kinds of vertical status relationships for which consent is insufficient, right? So just because the 14-year-old consents to sex with her high school coach, or the 16-year-old, or whatever, right? Do we care? Or in what registers do we care? Legal or not. So this, I was reading cases about this for my class tomorrow, the trouble with transgender rapists. So this looks at scope, the definitional scope requirements. So there's a bunch of cases in Israel, the UK, and the US, written about by Alex Sharp and Eyal Gross, and where the issue, the pattern is trans men or butch women are convicted of some kind of sexual assault for deceiving their partners into having sex, right? That the consent is vitiated by their sex assignment at birth. So these cases are pretty, are transphobic, but they raise the question. There is an important question about what do you consent to when you consent to sex, and what is the scope, and who bears what burden of risk, right? So if I meet someone at a bar and say I went to Yale when I went to Wesleyan, right, to bed them, do we, like, that we can all laugh at that, but like there are some kinds of forms of deception we might think maybe should be actionable, even if not criminal. Maybe they should be tortious. Okay. So I'll move a little more. So Horses and Corpses about the inappositeness of consent, and there I borrow heavily from Marion Case, who I think is not here, sadly. Right, the notion that when I look at these cases about sex with horses and sex with corpses, and the good liberal tends to think, you can't have sex with horses because they didn't consent, and the corpses didn't consent. But then you sort of think about it for 4 seconds, and you're like, consent doesn't usually apply to non-human animals, so asking if your dog consents to sit or to eat or whatever, and if you do think it applies, then you need to not eat meat, and factory farming and all of that. Corpses seem to me, the sort of consent inquiry is the same one you would apply to like an apple pie, right? Like it's just not, it seems like the wrong metric. That was an American Pie reference, and it was also glib, and so I apologize. Okay, and then I kind of put them all together in this to think about this Connecticut disability sexual assault case, which I won't get into now, but it opens up to my preferred abstractions over consent, autonomy and access, which I will not be talking about as extensively today, unless there's time or you want to ask about it in the question and answer period. But I'll just say I think of sort of offer feminist reconstructions of autonomy and access, and I borrow access from the disability studies and activism world, and rethink autonomy to say how could autonomy and access help us think through some of these problems in ways that consent might not, to world building toward a democratically hedonic sexual culture. That's the overarching thought, democratically hedonic sexual culture. Today though, so I'll focus on kink and cannibals. I also, I didn't pay attention to the time. These slides, so I gave a version of this talk to a group of non-gender and sexuality studies scholars trying to be like, people have thought about SM before me. And there's a whole history of kinky and kink sex practices before the term BDSM. So that's sort of all you need to know. But I'll say that when I think of sort of the first generation SM stuff was literature was from the 70s and 80s. That was largely debate within lesbian and feminist circles around, what is the valence of BDSM and how far does consent get you, and is this reiterating patriarchy versus resisting patriarchy? And I'm sort of giving a reductive version. In this Against SM anthology, Judy Butler has an entry, who's who she's since attenuated the position, but her point is sort of the way that SM practitioners themselves as being sort of their desires are above politics, and it's all about resisting patriarchy. And her critique, which will not surprise most of you, is like what kind of inflation of the sovereign subject is necessary to assume your desires don't have a politics or things like this. It's interesting. Okay. And then of course there's lots of back and forth about these debates, and so Pat Cliffia, among many other people, talk about reworking trauma by eroticizing it, or expanding possibilities of pleasure, or taking all the crappy stuff of the social and processing it as erotic raw material. Okay, so that was the sort of earlier debate. There's this, what I think of as sort of second generation BDSM scholarship is mostly in the kind of ethnographic vein. And not that the first generation wasn't scholarly, but these books seem not to be, or intervention seems not to be beset by the consent question, or by the patriarchy question. Margot Weiss is more interested in is kink neoliberal rather than is kink patriarchal. And also these I think are more interested in sort of studying kink as a subculture, as a set of subcultural practices rather than thumbs up or thumbs down. I'll just quote Margot Weiss here because it's helpful on terminology. BDSM is BDSM is a relatively recent and many suggest internet coinage. It is an amalgamation of three acronyms: B and D, bondage and discipline, BS, domination submission, and SM, sadomasochism. Which I realize doesn't really say much without further elaborations, but there it is. And SM, S/M, BDSM are all moves to depathologize, sadomasochism, the Kraft-Ebing term from 1886. Okay. My project is actually a return to these first questions. It just tries to take a different shape on the first set of questions. About consent and about consent's transformative force, whether ethically or legally. And yeah, again, this is like a really embarrassing slide, but the point is people have thought about kink. Okay. And also that history of practices of sex, that there, before the term was coined, there's a whole history of literary representations of sex that are kinky, involve power, theatrics, bondage, toys, role play, and so on. But the point is to say, I'm not Columbusing. Okay. I also should say kink refers, to more than just rough sex with a paddle, but that there's a kink culture and an SM literature and workshops and so on and so forth. In a way, a coordinate of this talk, I just realized this, a coordinate of this talk is when I went to the Women and Children First bookstore. Does that still exist?
Yeah.
And there was a BDSM thing, and they were practitioners and advocates, and it was I totally forgot about this. And they were going on and on about safe words and consent, how great consent was. And I was like, yeah, but on paper, doesn't the victim of intimate partner violence who says she consented in the kink look the same on paper? And she totally went ballistic and would not listen. Right, and so I learned how to sort of change your style for your audience. But that's kind of the inspiration of this talk. Okay, so all of that to say there's a subculture and it's more than rough sex with a paddle. Leads to my first question into the topic. Let's talk. To say, is this legit? Is this fair to sort of think about kink and about the ethics of kink and about sort of fetishizing the consent by using the German cannibal case as an example? As a grad student told me at Yale, Pat Cliffy gave a talk somewhere, I think in the 80s, that said, no, if you're sending your partner to the hospital, it's not kink, right? Which is to say there's a lot more in the kink repertoire besides consent, but that's kind of my point that we could elevate those abstractions and concepts. Okay, so that's one question, sort of, is it fair? The other question is, that my interrogations are not occurring in a vacuum, and if you read any of the literature on kink within kind of the gender sexuality studies ambit, the sort of running argument is the legal decisions are mired in homophobia and erotophobia, right? So the case commonly cited is the famous or infamous Spanner case from the UK from the early 90s, which is a group of gay men, police found videotapes, and they were doing kinky stuff in fish hooks through foreskins, and it was all very cringy when you're reading it. But the argument of sympathetic legal scholars is, the harms were kind of trumped up by the judges, and the decision, sort of drips with AIDS panic and homophobia, and Spanner becomes a case of erotophobia, homophobia being wrapped in judicial language, right? Okay. So and I guess to both of those cautions, I think one, I think the kink sympathetic scholars and activists kind of bring the question on by fixating so much on consent, right? I think the German cannibal case is a fair place to start because consent's the terrain that we're operating on. As for the Spanner case, Cheryl Hanna, a legal scholar, and others point out that Spanner is not representative. It is a phobic case. But if you look at appellate decisions that involve kinky sex across the U.S., what they are more often is rough sex defenses, right? Where he said she consented and that it was kinky, right? So I'll come back to that in a moment. But to say that erotophobia maybe isn't fully explanatory over these cases. Okay. All right, so thinking about the green light problem. The green light, what I'm thinking of is the green light problem, right? What does consent green light? And so to think through, and if we don't want to green light everything, what might be the side constraints, right? If we're not down with erotic cannibalism and consent doesn't do the work for us, then what would we want to do? Maybe you are down with erotic cannibalism, but I like my queer ethics to not be libertarian. Okay, so the big sports analogy. And I can come back to that. I mean, if a version of a talk I get, someone said like, but you never really said what was wrong with erotic cannibalism, but I'll try. Okay, so there's a big analogy in this literature to physical contact sports, and so why sports in the United States? So part of the reason the analogy is so popular to football and hockey, kink to football and hockey, is because the model penal code, and I'll come back to that in a moment, the model penal code permits consent as a defense to, quote, serious bodily injury if such injury is incurred in, quote, lawful athletic contest or competitive sport or other concerted activity not forbidden by law. So that's a whole bunch of jargon to say there is a sports exception to assault law, right? So if Chris and I go outside and I'm like, Kristen just like knock the shit out of me outside, like Kristen can get arrested for assault, and then I said please knock the shit out of me, should not be mitigating. It might be mitigating, okay, but it's assaultive. But that's not true in football. Okay, so in the MPC, consent in the model penal code consent is not a defense to assault unless, right, there are these exceptions. So states have adopted variants of this clause while refusing to permit consent as a defense to assault charges arising from alleged BDSM sex. I'll just pause very quickly here to say, in most state codes now, consent is a defense to sexual assault, right? In some states it's not because there's still a force requirement. Okay, the point is, when kink scholars talk about like kink cases, it's actually assault cases, right? The defendant is tried with assault because consent is not a defense to assault. So, okay, so that's why there's this focus on the assault statutes in the model penal code, and not sexual assault, at least here. Okay, so right, the analogy is if you're going to allow consent as a defense to football, why wouldn't you allow consent as a defense to kink? And so, as you might have gotten from the title, I think the analogy may work better in the other direction, right? Especially in relationship to football, right? So it seems to me the argument is not if we're going to allow football, we should allow kink, but probably that we should not allow football. Okay. So now we're in the why football is bad part of the talk. To speculate on reasons why, right? Why consent might be insufficient for football might help us think about the insufficiency of consent for sex. Okay. So I kind of came here by thinking of our football folk devils, and here are just some of them. So many of you are familiar with Colin Kaepernick, who takes a knee during the national anthem, protesting racialized disposability and Black Lives Matter. Ray Rice, right, knocked out his fiancée in the elevator, and the end was recorded. And Cam Newton, wasn't as infamous, but he had his moment his inglorious moment where like he was at a press conference and a journalist asked him a question. Basically, it was like, haha, you're a woman asking me a question about sports, right? And so then everyone got mad at him for being sexist. Okay. So, but I'll come back to that. So my point is, like, it seems to me like these sorts of figures and Michael Vick and whomever else this all has the making of a moral panic structure in a kind of technical Stanley Cohen way, where they become sites of condensation and displacement for broader social ills. They become bad guys, right? I think sort of ideological constructs for the moral catastrophe that is football. Yeah, that's my argument. Okay, so they become easy ways to say like, here are the bad guys, rather than like this whole thing is morally catastrophic and needs to end, as currently corporatized and preached and practiced. So I will say a lot of this part of the talk and the chapter comes from this book Against Football and other sources too. A sports journalist who was a diehard football fan and then like sort of had this come to Jesus moment and was like, wait, this is morally atrocious, and it is the spectacular takedown, forgive the pun, so to speak, from every dimension, not just chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which I'll come to in a moment, CTE, but about the way football exacerbates educational inequalities and urban poverty and racism and cultivates the worst gender norms and so on and so forth, which brings me to this point. And this is the point where I'm like, yeah, the WGSS scholars, like, football's bad, so who would listen to me, but whatever. Okay, so I will not elaborate all of these in detail, but I do think football is a nostrum. It's marketed and sold and imagined as a golden ticket to poor racial minority communities. It's 1 in 500 high school boys make it to the pros. It's attritional for nearly all. Football sustains the racialized inequities it promises to overcome. The sort of city's poorer argument is that taxpayers shell out 70% of the money for big stadiums while the rest of the city crumbles, and then the team owners get all the profits from the stadium. It cultivates the worst and narrowest patterns of gendered behavior, and he has these quotations where with like star athletes saying, really what it's all about, they train you how to knock out the other players, like it's really all about the knockout. And also like, strategizing to knock out the best player because then you have a better chance of winning, okay. And cultivates, I think, the narrowest and worst patterns of gendered behavior. Oh, and this calendar, but this is what I think this is my second wave moment. So this is the Panthers, like, whatever year it was calendar, 2017 calendar, and this is the same year that Cam Newton on the Panthers was like, haha, you're a woman journalist, ask me a question about sports. And then they had this calendar, which is all their cheerleaders wearing no clothing on trees, like, not doing anything. And so it's like, where's that criticism? Okay, well, here's a criticism. Right, and then, so okay. I will also acknowledge there is more to football, and there are some benefits, and there's a technical beauty to the sport that I probably don't understand. And most of the time when I was in grad school, I watched it, the Super Bowl. Like that was the one game I watched at Kit Kat on the north side with like dumbly colored martinis. And okay, so you might not, I might not be the most convincing, opponent of football. But I do think that I have come to think that it's undeniable that under any moral philosophy, the costs outweigh the benefits. And that's not just about CTE, about chronic traumatic encephalopathy and brain damage, although that's really bad too. So the high school players are twice as more likely to get concussed as college players because there are fewer regulations in high school, even though that seems to be kind of changing. And the other thing that you may know about CTE is you don't need to be concussed. So all of these sort of cognitive ailments are from repeated brain injuries that don't have to show up as manifest as concussions. But my laundry listing here is to also say there are non-physical injuries to football too, and I'll come back to that in a moment. They're not just about the physical injury to the body. Okay. Oh, right. This is from a. Okay, so my point here is, with apologies to Mubar, is so Odmond cites a Purdue University medical researcher who says, quote, you have the classic stereotype of the dumb jock, and I think the real issue is that's not how they start out, right? So the argument is that we are making high schoolers dumber by having repeated injuries to the head. What I'm getting at is that I think this unduly or unjustly impedes people's ability to do and be in the world. And here's language I'm borrowing from Nussbaum from the capabilities approach, right? That there's a kind of threshold of impediment around being and doing in the world, and football surpasses that threshold. Okay. So the actual reason that the consensual violence of football is permitted, whereas the consensual violence of some sex is prescribed, is that only one of these activities generates astronomical profit, mostly but not exclusively for white men, what Charles Mills dubs white opportunity hoarding. We can imagine that the difference between a knocked-out football player and Janae Palmer, Ray Rice's then-fiancée, is the difference between consent and non-consent, refereed group activity and unrefereed intimate relationships. But should we unequivocally permit, let alone promote, the counterfactual, in which Janae asked, as a part of a kink scene, to be knocked out? What if Janae were Jamal? What if, as part of this kink scene, Ray and Jamal wore jockstraps and tights and knocked each other out on artificial turf instead of in a sling? Under critical race rather than queer theoretic lights, the sport exception to assault statutes in U.S. jurisprudence is less about sex negativity than racialized disposability, which bodies matter. And I'll just say this is not a story about causes, right? So the sports exception, the NBC was probably drafted when when the NFL or whatever version Anthony, I don't know this, but when the NFL was still racist. So this is not a story about what led to the exemption, but it's to say what are the effects now. All right, so then, if we want to say, okay, maybe if you're with me, and we're like, consent might not be the green light to all kinds of social or sexual practices like football or erotic cannibalism. What else might there be in our sort of, ethical / legal repertoire? One of the side constraints that's posed often in literature on this is seriousness, right? That if the injury is serious, then consent should not be a legit defense. And the argument is basically to apply the same exception to kink that football gets, but to do so in a non-homophobic, non-erotophobic way, right? So like actual seriousness as opposed to, so think about like the fish hook through the scrotum or whatever, is like it sounds horrible and cringeworthy, but also it is not permanent, it goes away and like whatever, right? Okay. Not like whatever, but you see what I think this is misguided. I think because I think the seriousness in the literature in the Model Penal Code ends up being located on the body, as in serious physical injury to the body, or grievous and permanent is the MPC language, but grievous and permanent injury to the body. And I think the focus on the body and the injury it sustains is misleading. So remember that part where Lauren was like, I don't make up shiny new words to get at a problem? So here's a shiny new word that's ugly to get at a problem, which I'm thinking of as the corporeal normativity of seriousness, or the kind of the hyper-focus on the body. So this is, maybe a contradiction in terms, and we all like hate sentences that start with the history of Western philosophy. But in the history of Western philosophy, right, a common theme is the downplaying or degrading of the body, right? Elevation of the mind, a dualism that separates and subordinates mind over body. So it's sort of like, what am I talking about? Normativity of seriousness. Iris Young refers to that kind of degradation or downgrading of the body as somatophobia, which I like. And so I'll just say I think this is not a contradiction. I think it's the flip side of the same question, right? Like I think the sort of hyper infatuation with the body and its emissions and its processes is sort of all part of the same dualism or the same problem. Okay, and so I think the hyper focus runs both problems that are both over inclusive and under inclusive. Over inclusive is a sort of serious and permanent injury leads one to question tattoos and piercings and scarification, also gender affirming surgery, like permanent and grievous injury. And so that seems misguided to have this focus on just on permanent bodily injury or harm. Okay, and under inclusive is because I think it misses some of the kinds of harms that we might care about. So in State v. Van, I'll just briefly go through this case. Roger Van met JCG, who they call him online. Does anyone know this case? No. Okay. So they met online, and JCG was like, I am in a master sub relationship, but it's not master subby enough, and I want to be super subby, and I'm gonna fake my own death and escape. And he was living in Houston, and he goes to Nebraska, and I don't want to have safe words, and I want you to put me into a cage, and I'm going to tell you I want to get out of the cage, but I'm telling you in this email, but I don't want to get out of the cage, so don't listen to me, and do all these horrible things to me, and I want to be your slave forever and eventually die in your hands. And so Roger Van is like, okay, cool. So that all happens, and then JCG, he's kept in a cage, in like a 4-foot by 6-foot windowless cage in a basement for a week. And Van and his other amanuensis sub-person do all sorts of horrible things to JCG and brand him and whatever. Okay, so after a week, JCG is like, I don't want to be here anymore. And Van, like a good sex-positive college student, looks at the emails and sees like affirmative consent, like he wants me to continue caging him. So he double-checked the consent and continued to abuse him. And then the amanuensis guy is like, I think he's telling the truth. And so he helped JCG escape. JCG escapes, goes back to his lover and father. They're not the same person. His lover and his father. That was a whole different question. And then they convince him to prosecute, to go to the cops. And so Van is convicted of assault, sexual assault, false imprisonment, terroristic threats, a whole bunch of statutes. And so one of the questions Van raised was, well, based on this statute alone, you should be criminalizing tattoo artists and and scarification artists, whatever. And the court just said that's not before us, whatever. Okay, but my interest in this case is some folks have written about this, and they've written all about the grievous injury, and it's all been about the body, and like no one's talked about keeping him in a cage for a week with no windows. And what does that mean? And can we think about that as a kind of injury around being and doing in the world that doesn't focus so much on the body? And to kind of preempt the criticism that my version of the body is an indefensible modern one that doesn't think about, say, the bodily effects of solitary confinement, that's true. But the law's version of the body is modern, so that's my excuse. Okay. Right. So I think that's under-inclusive to focus on the body, to sort of miss this imprisonment as its own kind of sexual injury. Of course, once we canvass the problem of caging and imprisonment as grievous impediments to being and doing, this opens out to a much bigger question that I'm not going to take on here. But what kind of punishment for what kind of crime? And more for this talk, can thinking in this way help us think too about the wrongs of football beyond the physical, right? Beyond CTE. So the other, I just want to make sure, I feel like I've been talking for like 2 hours now. Okay. How long have I been talking for? Like 30 minutes, 35 minutes?
About probably like 40 minutes.
Okay, okay. Thanks all for bearing with me. So the other, I have like 8 more minutes. Okay, so the other Sackett-Schen's dignity. And I'll be quick. Basically, this law professor Vera Bergelsen says it should be, it should be that if the injury is violates human dignity, then maybe consent is insufficient, right? This is convoluted, but basically she's like, since dignity can be sort of has wide interpretive latitude, I'm going to say dignity plus long-term interests. So if the activity violates your long-term interests and your dignity, then it's not kosher. And my argument simply is, once she's added the long-term welfare interest business, she no longer needs the dignity, so I'm not sure why it's there. And the counterfactual is, with the German cannibal case, right, even if they had like vanilla sex with like lots of lube, and everyone was happy, and there was no pain, and there was no penis removal, and you just like shot him dead, right, like instantly killed him, we would still probably think that's not okay. And then if you want to say it, well, ending a life like that just is not dignified, then you're just kind of equating dignity with long-term interests, right? So I'm not sure what dignity is doing there. So this is the dignity coda. Dubious sense of dignity. Okay. I'll try to be on the quicker side. But so, and this is the next article. It's my investigation into researching the side constraints beyond or in tandem with consent that brought me to dignity, and the dilemma over dignity. I gesture toward here prodded me to think more deeply about dignity as the core normative foundation of Nussbaum's capabilities approach. In part because the capabilities approach directly and indirectly guides all sorts of other normative presuppositions and aspirations of screw consent. So the article that we're working on, Capability Without Dignity, that will be a title, or depending on where we end up, it'll be called Capability Without Dignity, ? So we'll see where we go. And the ruminations here are preliminary and sketchy and offered in a most intellectually generous spirit, in part because I thought Martha might be here, but she's not. So great. But I do owe a lot to her, and this talk does. So I won't do justice to the capabilities approach, so to speak, even the intricacies of its relationship to dignity and its phenomenal influence over all sorts of theorists and theories and projects of justice. But I'll say, as many of you know, Nussbaum proffers her capabilities approach, a renovation of Amartya Sen's work on capabilities in global economics, as a powerful counter-proposal to Rawls's model of justice as fairness. Nussbaum substitutes Rawls's political conception of the human as rational and autonomous with a political conception of the human as variably needy and dependent, asking correspondingly, what does justice require for needy and dependent subjects to lead lives worthy of dignity? Far beyond a just distribution of goods in the Rawlsian register, far beyond a just distribution of goods, material provisions, and rights, dignity demands a basic governing structure, the state, that enables subjects to reach a minimum threshold of these 10 central capabilities. Among them, life, bodily health, bodily integrity, practical reason, but also affiliation and play. So this move both enlarges the requirements of justice, what states must do, and expands the recipients or subjects of justice, who is entitled, who gets to be entitled to this minimum threshold of capabilities. So we'll call it the CA. She calls it the CA. capabilities approach. The CA, premised as it is upon realizing lives worthy of dignity, has a sharply different, more promising, and frankly more psychologically sound answer to the question, why do we act in concert to create just institutions? Then does Rawls's justice as fairness, premised as it is upon human moral powers of rationality and reason. So for Rawls, we contract together because we expect mutual advantage from the ensuing collective. For Nussbaum, following Aristotle and Marx, we act in concert for a just society because we are social creatures, whose dignity materializes in sociality. Indeed, we are dignified in our needing and depending upon others. And here I will just gesture and not talk about the ways in which that version of dignity is itself very different from, Ciceronian dignity or Kantian dignity or Catholic dignity. Connecting rationality and reason with dignity, a dignity for which practical reason is componential but not comprehensive of dignity, contra Kant. Justice notably and imperatively extends to non-human animals and persons with significant intellectual disabilities. Nussbaum herself elaborates and expands the capabilities approach in these and other directions, and the theoretical contributions have been widely, beautifully picked up by others, with due regard for the role of dignity. So these are just two recent examples. Don Kulik, who is to be at the University of Chicago, and Jen Richard wrote this beautiful book, Loneliness and Its Opposite, that thinks through the capabilities approach and about dignity to argue that we should be respecting and, much more importantly, resourcing and assisting the erotic lives of people with significant disabilities. Shada Mafred's book, she at the end of it sort of argues that the dignity and the capabilities approach from Nussbaum offers a more expansive and capacious way to think about justice for the injuries suffered disproportionately by black women, and that the CA is sort of a necessary corrective to the racial justice theories of Tommy Shelby and Charles Mills, right? So that's just, I'm sort of giving shout outs to these books because I like these books. Okay. So those are a fraction of the benefits of theorizing justice with dignity, but what might be some of the costs? So I've already enumerated what I take to be the cost of dignity. It's conceptual promiscuity, and I kind of jumped over that. But Bergelson says, fishhook thing, that'll be okay because, long-term interest. But this other guy, Dennis Baker's like, no. Like, all of that stuff should be criminal because it's undignified, right? He also thinks sex between serodiscordant partners should be criminal because it's undignified, right? So this is the problem. This is the kind of problem I'm getting at with dignity, sort of the deeply nasty sex-negative place it goes. Put most bluntly, I am not sure what dignity means, and its pluripotent seems to make it serviceable for all kinds of projects: emancipatory, feminist, socially transformative, conservative, sex-negative, anti-feminist. Nussbaum and Dixon allude, in an article on abortion and capabilities approach, Nussbaum and Rosalind Dixon allude to dignity's interpretive latitude, writing, "Dignity is an intuitive notion that is by no means utterly clear." I'll come back to the article in a moment. Law professor at Yale, Samuel Moyn, observes the very different ways dignity circulated in the 2012 Republican and Democratic Party platforms. So in the former, the Republican Party platform, dignity is invoked against abortion and same-sex marriage. In the latter, it's invoked on behalf of women's rights and health care. So the argument I'm making is similar to Bernard Harcourt's about harm in 1999. Okay. The dignity argument has been famously stretched in all the directions over abortion, right? So, and this is a bunch of scholars have pointed to this. In Gonzalez v. Carhart, upheld the 2003 Partial Birth Abortion Act in part to respect fetal dignity. And the decision also infamously gestures that the ban might respect the dignity of the woman who would later come to regret her abortion were the partial birth abortion permitted. So this strikes most of us as anti-feminist and patronizing, but Reed Siegel points out that dignity argument has a longer political history among religious right organizations, right? That the dignity of the woman who may regret her decision. And of course, kinky sex. Bergelson would not criminalize sex with fishhooks. This guy, Dennis Baker, would. Okay. So Nussbaum herself, in Frontiers of Justice, intimates that this indeterminacy of dignity, when she in her conversations with Adam Smith and Karl Marx, Smith recalls Nussbaum observed, quote, that what is compatible with human dignity may itself vary from society to society, and she notes, for example, shirtlessness in public may or may not be dignified in one locale, attesting to dignity's social and historical contingency. Nussbaum cites Marx to buttress the point that some modes of eating, moving, and interacting are, quote, compatible with human dignity, other modes are presumptively undignified, but this begs the question, right? This begs the question, which mode is which, and according to which principles? They write, human dignity requires not just giving some food, but giving choices regarding nutrition, not just health, but choice regarding health. And so I wonder what would happen if we switch this, or imagine the replacement. human dignity requires not just giving some opportunities for sexual satisfaction, but giving choices regarding sexual satisfaction. I'm using the language from their capability, from her capabilities approach, right? So in one of the capabilities, bodily integrity, it says people should have the opportunities for sexual satisfaction. And the capabilities are supposed to be non-fungible, non-hierarchical. So sexual satisfaction is supposed to matter as much as every other capability. Okay. This, to me, I think sharpens the dignity dilemma. For if some sex practices seem undignified, surely denying people a subset of sexual practices also seems like a denial of dignity, adaptive preferences notwithstanding. My hunch is that neither Nussbaum nor her CA would have little interest in the regulation of like piss play, but be very much concerned with the regulation, even outright prescription, of erotic cannibalism. And if that's the case, it may not be the distinction between piss play and erotic the distinction between piss play and erotic cannibalism has less to do with dignity than with striving, agency, decisional autonomy, and these sorts of normative principles that often orbit very closely to Nussbaum's dignity discussion. And so the article we have not yet written, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to flesh it out, flips the logic of this chapter, Kink and Cannibals. Rather than ask how might the capabilities approach and its central role for dignity govern social practices like kink and football, it asks how social practices like kink and football may complicate dignity's central role in Nussbaum's renovated capabilities approach. Another way to say this within the CA lexicon itself is that the bodily health capability and with it its language of adequate shelter, nourishment, and good health may conflict with the bodily integrity capability and its opportunities for sexual satisfaction. Right, so we could argue that JCG didn't have adequate shelter, but that was an opportunity for his sexual satisfaction. Two final points to this coda. So basically in the abortion article, or I think it's called, I had it up there, but abortion, the capabilities approach, Dixon and Nussbaum want to end up saying that the dignity of the adult pregnant woman generally matters more than the dignity of the fetus, even as they accord dignity to the fetus. It sort of feels like ad hoc, but they want to make that argument, and they do this by according, quote, striving and agency as componential of the adult woman's dignity, but not the fetus, right? She has potential for striving and agency, the fetus doesn't, so we should defer to decisions to respect the woman and her decision to abort the fetus and to respect the dignity of the fetus. Right, and that fits in with a sort of larger argument in that article about wanting to complement health-based arguments to women's dignity in choosing an abortion to individual liberty or decisional autonomy-based arguments supporting women's dignity. I.e., they're looking at like the policy legal world around abortion and noticing that reproductive justice groups are saying, this is a woman's dignity issue because of her health. And Nussbaum and Dixon will say yes, and also it's a dignity issue because of women's, freedom and autonomy, right? And what I'm noticing is there's a lot of autonomy language and freedom language and striving and agency language when the thing she thinks she's talking about is dignity. So this is all a medium-long or long way of saying perhaps it's striving, agency, and autonomy, not dignity itself, that might stealthily ground the capabilities approach. But, point two, in another article on children and the capabilities approach, Nussbaum and Dixon propose that striving and agency are themselves dangerously normatively unanchored. In a footnote, and here you see the UChicago in me, like in footnote 79, that's actually a Bernard Harcourt thing. Okay, anyway, in footnote 79 of this article, that I'm not citing properly, Nussbaum reports a debate with Amartya Sen that facilitating capabilities for capability's sake, for developing any and all human capabilities, could risk encouraging the capability, say for violence, or the capability for racial discrimination. Right? So even as dignity authorizes robust, expansive state provisions and entitlements, the facilitation of opportunities that the Rawlsian basic structure does not, dignity also, I think, holds cabining force, delimiting the kinds of capabilities to be cultivated, right? Like encouraging the capability to discriminate is not dignified. So the questions moving forward on this project are, if not dignity, what? If dignity can the concept be further clarified, along with its correlating costs, and if we want to opt instead for something like striving, agency, or autonomy, can these be morally qualified without recourse to dignity? That's sort of where I'm going to end. I'm not going to talk about autonomy and access, but just say these are the abstractions that I put forward in the chapter in the book, offering. I try to say, disability studies folks are worried about autonomy and what it implies, and gender and sexuality folks are worried about access and what it implies. But if you kind of cross-pollinate and take access from the disability studies world, take autonomy, kind of relational autonomy from the feminist theoretic world, you can do so productively to address some of the questions in kink and cannibals and other problems. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question about the temporality of the capability approach, especially in relation to one term in the Aristotelian version, but also in Muslim's version, which is flourishing. So I thought that when you were going to go back to the example about confinement, that the risk of PTSD and the preclusion of future sexual satisfaction might play a part there. So I'm wondering about like whether you're justifying
Bug. Wait, sorry. We're just give me a second. I think it's fine. It is surface level damage. Sorry for that crisis. Okay. Right. So I define the so I use Nussbaum here to talk about think about autonomy as thank you. To think about autonomy as a capability to co-determine sexual relationships. So I'm like kind of triangulating with Stephen Schulhofer and all these liberal legal theorists and feminist relational theorists on autonomy and say, what if we thought of autonomy as a capability to co-determine sexual relations rather than equate autonomy with consent, which is what happens in this literature. To say, and it's sort of counterintuitive to say, can it violate your sexual? Can you choose things that violate your sexual autonomy, right? And I kind of want to make the case that you can. That in fact, choosing to be in a basement cage for 2 weeks, that we care on sexual autonomy grounds about this is impeding your flourishing. Yeah, is that?
That answers the question, but it seems like you're not just doing away with dignity, but also with flourishing. Because then the only thing that matters is sexual satisfaction or the fulfillment of sexual satisfaction in the event of sex that you're isolating. But then there's no consideration for what kind of like sexual satisfaction might happen in the future or any other kind of satisfaction or like coming into being as like a flourishing human being.
But I think that's right. That's the problem with caging someone, is that you delimit any possibility for right. I mean, like one of the arguments, like Corey Brettschneider's argument about capital punishment, is that he wants punishments that people could reasonably agree on in a kind of it's a theoretical theory. It's a whatever. The point is, could citizens reasonably agree to be punished this way? And his argument is, no, we can't have capital punishment because you can't discuss this with someone who's dead. Like they have to be there. And that's kind of my thought about this with sexual autonomy too. Is like if you do things that so impede your ability, for flourishing and for I guess I'm focusing on sexual flourishing, right? Then I think that's a problem. And in an article that I didn't get to, they talk about these kink scholars and practitioners talk about deep consent in the scene. There's 3 kinds of consent. There's surface consent, scene consent, and deep consent. So the surface is like what we think of as consent. The scene is I don't know what we think of as consent. The scene consent is, there's a scene and there's a role play and we're all agreeing to this and here's a contract, whatever. And then they have this deep consent, which is ridiculous. Like it's a contradiction in terms. And basically what the deep consent is imagine yourself as the future sub-self of the sub that you are doing horrible things to, and if you can't imagine that person consenting later on, then you should not do this thing. But what it really means is like, don't be an asshole. As in, if the sub says, I really want you to cut my face off, the top is supposed to be like, I don't think you're going to want me to cut your face off like 10 minutes from now. And the article that I talks about this is like deep consent, and I just think like let's just be honest. Like you're actually contravening the apparent preferences of the sub. So for me, I think what a kind of feminist reconstructive autonomy gets to is a capability to determine sexual intimate relationships is to say, I think this violates your sexual autonomy. I think that kind of injury is wrongly violative because it impedes your sexual autonomy. Yeah. I still feel like maybe we're talking past you, but okay. We're talking past you.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question about what you pointed to as chapter 3 of the book, and this might also sort of be connected to the first book also. I guess it's a question about deception and what people want from consent. So I was drawn to your description of chapter 3 because part of what animates my interest in consent is HIV criminalization cases, and deception plays like a big role in those cases. And what's often interesting to me is that people who are quote unquote victims in those cases sometimes report knowing the status of the other person, consenting, and still sort of feeling duped by like the interaction, right? And so it seems that something like the provision of information is still not enough to undermine deception on one hand, but then on the other hand, it also sort of seems that the person or the people in these cases want more from consent than I'm not sure. And so, and to complicate this further, I often find that, and you sort of demonstrated this when you were talking about talking to the women and children group about like something about consent, and then that sort of disrupting the space, and then people feeling like, you know, you were sort of frustrating the flow of things or their attachment to consent. So yeah, I guess the question is sort of like, what do people want from like consent as a framework? Like, what do they want to get from it if even when sort of information is given, things seem safe, people still feel sort of duped by like a situation or like, you know, report injury? Like, what do you think their attachment is to it?
Yeah, so, I mean, I should say, so 2 pages into this book called Screw Consent, I'm like, let's not screw consent everywhere. And mainly like in law, let's not screw consent because it's the least bad metric we have between like force and non-consent and affirmative consent and desire, I think, which is a disaster. I think, you know, consent's the least shitty, the least crappy, you know, threshold we've got. And I say desire is a mess because like Robin West kind of moves in this direction, but it's like, you know, there's a lot of chosen undesired sex, like for babies or for whatever else, like, you know, or like sex is just mediocre, better than doing your homework or whatever. So I think desire is probably not where we want the criminal law to go. The HIV, it's so funny. So tomorrow I'm teaching the Jed Rubenfeld article on this deception, and also Kim Sheo Buchanan's article, which is a great article called "When Is HIV a Crime?" And basically argues that like through the language of consent and sort of public health language, we're targeting mostly men of color, straight men of color. Actually, is sort of the and when she wrote the thing, I think there was not great data yet, but I think Trevor Hoppy's book also gets at this. Anyway, so you know, I think so. Jed Rubenfeld had this article in 2013 that was kind of like infamous for a little while, which is basically this question of like, if we switch from a force standard to a consent standard, how far do we ride this train? Like, who bears what burden of risk? And he's like, there is no limit. So, you know, if like makeup is deceptive, or what I say on Grindr is deceptive, or whatever, right? Like all of that could then be criminal. And so he freaks out and says we have to go back to a force requirement. And then everyone freaked out about that. So, you know, there have been a bunch of answers, like bunch of responses to that, and of course HIV non-disclosure comes up a lot. You know, a couple of questions come up, responses that come up. One is the law is never logical, and there's all kinds of principles that govern rape law, and consent is just one of them. And there's also sexual subordination and a whole bunch of other, you know, ideas. One is the more technical, like there's a difference between non-disclosure and deception, and there is a difference between non-disclosure and deception. And there's this like thing, you know, concept in the law called materiality, which is sort of like the you know, but for, like there's kind of like reasonable expectation, like would this have mattered, right? Is it, you know, if you told me you had a goldfish, that shouldn't matter as much as, you know, if you had a penis at birth or if you're HIV positive. I think materiality is dangerous because it's so normative, you know, and you know, so I don't know if this is a really the kind of weird answer I come up with in the book. Because I think Rubenfeld kind of has a point, is twofold. One is I'm actually okay with regulating or making against the law the contravention of an explicit conditional, but probably as a tort, not as a crime, so that you don't go to jail. So for example, if it's like, you know, I will only have sex with you if and only if, you know, you went to the University of Chicago, right? And the person's like, I went to Chicago, and they, you know, went to, I don't know, Notre Dame or something. Like, that's so ridiculous, but I'm kind of like, actually, if we do believe in sexual autonomy as like impending your choice structure, and this person makes it very clear what they want, and like, you just totally lie about it, like that seems, if we think sex is special, and Lauren says sex is special, then I think it's okay to think this is a wrong. The other part of that with all these cases about transception is that I don't think "Are you a man?" is subject to a truth claim in the law. I don't think it should be. So I think questions like, I'll have sex with you if and only if you went to this college seems to me answerable as a truth claim. Are you a man? I think isn't. And it's sort of, that's like, this is like gender and sexuality studies 101. Like, what does it mean to lie? I mean, so, right, okay. Yeah.
So, in criminal law, it's consent. In civil law, it's welcomeness.
Right.
And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference you see in that.
Yeah. Right. And welcomeness, like, is also the standard in sexual harassment law, which, sexual harassment is not a crime. It's a civil violation, or civil rights infraction. In one way, it seems like affirmative consent reforms are trying to move towards I'll complicate the answer in a second. Are trying to move towards a kind of welcomeness standard, right? That if I think for a lot of activists, what's appealing about affirmative consent is that it's translating your desire, right? In fact, as McKinnon says, you can, there are a lot of forced yeses, right? Okay, so that's too complicated. But the other thing about welcomeness is that it's really the issue is the totality of the circumstances question that I don't know always translates to non-work environments, and then I would worry about kink, even though I don't worry too much about kink, which is, it seems to make sense to me in a civil case that the standard is more capacious and there's more totality of the circumstances. So like, is your boss saying all of these horrible sexist things to you? Welcome, and like I'm sort of more comfortable with that inference than a welcomeness standard around, I would be nervous around juries applying that to like retroactively applying that to like a sex party. Do you know what I mean? Where the stakes are higher, like imprisonment, because like a lot of shady stuff happens in sex clubs that if brought to a jury would like not seem welcome, but I'd be nervous about because it wasn't welcome, it's now a crime, right? I'm sort of thinking aloud, so I'm not sure I endorse everything I just said, even though I'm recorded saying it. Yeah. But it does seem to me like wantedness is more defensible in a civil realm than a criminal one, in part because the stakes are lower. Thanks, guys. Yeah.
Let me try and, like on the verge of having this in like a formulated basketball way. So there are a bunch of games that have come out in the last, video games that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years, right? That are like games that are focused on consent. So Annie Maricopas wrote this big article about what games could learn from BDSM, and then a bunch of people that make queer games make games about consent.
Right.
And the interesting thing about all of these games, right, is that one is always sort of topping for that scene, right? So one is always sort of topping the scene.
Oh.
So like consent is always the limitation on the player's agency and how they can interact with the person or like the NPC that they are interacting with. And like in like BDSM educational contexts, it seems to be like focused in that way as well. So like there's some, and I don't really know how to formulate this, but it seems like there's something interesting about when you're talking about consent as a limitation, who is that limitation on, and sort of like the constraints of that limitation, and what would happen if we started thinking, if you designed a game along those lines where it's like, okay, you have to negotiate your consent, and then when you've negotiated this thing, something happens to you. How good was your negotiating skills?
Right.
Which is like a much more terrifying game.
Right.
Right. But there's something there about like genres of interaction and communication and like the direction of consent. And it seems like your approach manages to like sidestep like the way that this thing doesn't look the same from both sides.
Right. I just want video games that are about facilitating democratically hedonic sexual culture. Which is to say, like, there's so many more interesting questions to ask about intimacies and relationships and good sex and that like this is my like like I think the big polemic pieces of this book is, don't screw consent in law, but screw it everywhere else, as in like our sexual justice politics and our imaginations. And I think part of why we're magnetized to consent is because the language of law is attractive and sounds declarative, and and we're drawn to bright lines sometimes. But that there's more exciting things to do and say about sex and about intimacy, and also about ethical sex. And so another should be, where I end up on the book is to say, like, I think bad sex should be a bigger problem. I mean, and that we think of the like sex positive groups on campus as like where the weird queer feminist kids go, but actually like we could think about those sexual literacy forums and things like this as places that should be really central in our minimizing bad as in really bad, not just like but like really bad sex that doesn't reach the level of rape, and so why am I saying this all about video games? I mean, relationships in response to video games, because I think still from I don't know this, but from what you described it still seems to me to run on the presumption that consent is going to distinguish rape from rockstar sex, and I'm sort of more interested in the really bad sex that might not count as rape, for which consent doesn't help you all that much. Yeah. Go ahead.
No.
Yeah. Okay. Lauren, go for it.
No, that's
Okay, go for it.
So like you have that quote way at the beginning of your slides where you say that your thesis for the first book is that like if normative sex was heterosexual, now it's consensuality. What do you think it is about like this time where consensuality is so important? And like I study professional cuddlers, and consensual dyadic consensual exchange is so important. And I'm just trying to think through myself too about like why is this the dominant model not only for sex but just for any kind of interaction between two separate people, where they want to take the consensual model to every realm of life. So like what do you think is going on?
Right. I mean, the bad answer is neoliberalism, and that's not the right answer.
Like, but no, that's
So-
why do you think though? Like, I'm just trying to formulate it myself, like why neoliberalism.
Right. So I mean, that is one answer, right? And they're kind of individualizing impulse of neoliberalism. But the reason why that's also a bad answer is that it's historically inaccurate. And so, the Wolfenden report is in 1957, right? The Model Penal Code is 1962. So like you see in liberal legal language, consent has its moments prior to the early aughts or whatever. I just had a thought that left me. Oh, in the 70s, right? There was a big move to argue that the issue with child sexual abuse is not. It might not be that there's horrible sequelae, because maybe sometimes there aren't horrible sequelae, or that it's sick and pathological with the consent problem, right? So that was sort of a 1970s moment of consent. So I'm kind of evading your question, but I'm also saying there are different stories to tell about when consent, if you did the Google word search, like when it became popular in what zones. But it does seem, and I'm still evading your question, it does seem to me that the popularizing of consent now just indexes how terribly impoverished our vocabulary still is for thinking sexual justice. Yeah. But think more about it. Yeah, Lauren.
Yeah, so the way I was thinking about her question before she asked it was the problem is stuff is fun. When will it be bad? And if you ask the question that way, that's a question of whether or not we have any belief at all in any structural protections against the future badness of the stuff that's fun. So football is fun. Adolescent sex where you're throwing your body at it might be fun, might not be fun, but you kind of want to do it whether or not you're having the experience of funness. But then the problem of the state and the problem of the law is, do we know enough about this when the stuff that's fun will be bad, that we can start litigating in advance of when it will be bad. And I think this is related to JT's question about the future, though I wouldn't go to flourishing as the metric here. And that's one of the reasons why neoliberalism isn't a bad answer, because neoliberalism is about the long withdrawal of belief in the law, the state, institutional norms, and normativity itself as a kind of constraint on the question of when will fun be bad. The history of people being poisoned by pleasure. And people knew it and didn't care. You knew that like 10,000 people a year were going to die in that car, but you didn't really care because stuff was fun, and you didn't really care when it would be dead. So, I don't know. I wish you would say more about that problem. Like, I think that's a bigger problem than the dignity problem, because there's no dignity in sex. That just seems like a red herring anyway. But the question of, you're busy becoming disorganized with other humans and yourself. What's dignity when the whole condition of it is the losing of the shape? So, and not in trouble. Anyway. Yeah.
For me, intellectually, what's appealing about dignity and like unpacking dignity is that like, yes, but then also you have people being like, no, we're dignified in our need and in our disorganization and our dependence. So that's why I think it's right. I think you're right. It is a red herring, but I also one worth talking about.
I'm vegan, so herring.
And thinking about your question, I was thinking about Wendy Brown makes this point well in Undoing the Demos about the evacuation of anything like a world to hold you up and to displace displace or redistribute the when the fun goes badly problem, and so then it becomes all about you and me and consent, and the translation. And I don't know if Joan Scott's actually written about this or just heard her talk about this. The kind of translation of structural problems into hurt feelings or into violated feelings. I think they're part of the same. Well, go ahead. Oh, I think Lauren's written about this. But you wrote about this like in 1993.
Well, that's what this means by what?
Well, I don't know. But it's not a noun.
Right, that's inside the point. But so I guess one of the ways that left academics stop thinking, which I don't believe you have, so I'm not saying that's not you secretly, is they say X is dangerous. Oh, it's dangerous to give the law that permission, or it's dangerous to give the state that permission, or it's dangerous to give parents, or terrible judges of anything, that permission. Who would we give permission to? You start, all you experience is your skepticism of any normative judgment at all about who's going to tell you, who's going to help you not make the fun go bad in a way that will, and this is where I think your discourse on permanence really mattered, that will stay in everything. So I don't know, if you have stuff to say.
I don't know, but I think, and maybe I'm just getting tired, but I think that...
Sorry.
No. I mean, the other thing that maybe drives this book and drove the thoughts with the first one is I'm not a fan of the anti-statist version of queer studies, where like everything is dangerous. And yes, we know all the ways in which not all, okay, right? That the state's a complicated ally, but it seems like it's not going anywhere, even though everyone says it's always dying. And so I say this to my students, and the question is not what's the right law, it's like what's the least wrong law, And so yes, it's always going to be bad, but which cost can we bear? And it seems not the thing to jettison law outright. But to minimize it in its language in our visions of social justice projects, the sexual social justice projects.
We can end now.
I'll be. Okay, so your question quick-ish.
Possibly.
Go for it.
So my question was just kind of the role of risk assessment in this.
Oh, yeah.
And in terms of both a legal context, but also in talking about what do you include when you're talking about over-inclusivity, like in terms of like tattooing and piercing, right? Is that kind of like where there's this idea of the professional and of the ability to assess the risk that you're undertaking, and kind of where that falls in terms of consent when it's someone who is not necessarily an expert, quote unquote, in what they're about to do.
Right. A couple weeks ago I was on a panel called Queer Risk, and I was like, I don't know, I shouldn't be on this panel because I've avoided the R word in most of my work, which is probably unjustifiable given what I'm talking about. And this too, risk becomes what Norm's saying, thinking about risk is dangerous because it's captured by experts, and because the way, and also, primarily because the way risk is racialized, at-risk youth and things like this, and what kinds of interventions that authorizes. So here's this. I don't know if this is really an answer to your question, but the expert, I don't know if with the experts, because actually you don't really need licenses to be tattoo artists and to do all that, right? And to pierce and whatever.
Well, I mean, you do, but
You
Some
do.
states,
Or is it
yes.
state by state?
it's state by state, but it is like a
Okay.
legal like boundary where it would affect like if you like mess up someone's tattoo
Right,
and
right,
you didn't
right.
have a license, like they
Right.
could, yeah.
Okay,
check,
forgive
yeah.
me about that. But I'm thinking of some other professions. I don't know. But anyway, so right. I mean, the answer there is just that on facially, so to speak, like it is the tattoo is permanently injuring your, permanently affecting your body or whatever. So I don't know if risk is the most germane question there. Maybe I'll end here, kind of answer your question and tying this back to Warren, which is in disability scholarship, there's this dignity of risk notion that was widely published in activism and scholarship, right? That you the idea is you want to facilitate, then part of the social model is facilitating people with disabilities to get to risk the bad shit too, right? Like you don't want to just protect them from sex altogether because they have a right to have mediocre sex also, just like the rest of us, temporarily able folks. And in a way, what I ended up saying, and I'm going to convolute this, like I was talking about Me Too at the end, because there's Me Too in the book, at the queerist panel, like part of what I think is the common thread between, the Me Too gets accused of lumping, right? Aziz Ansari with Harvey Weinstein, the predator with the prankster, the jokester, and I want to say, well, actually, feminism is always about lumping project. Like it's a lumping project. Like, this happened to you, this happened to me, and so like you think about okay. But I think part of what aggregates it is not it's all sexual assault or it's all not consensual, right? See the Ansari debate, but that it's men leveraging their gender and authority to deny indexically women abilities to take the risks that they want to take, right? Like they don't get to risk having the kinds of sex they might want to have because there's a kind of way in which men are insuring against the risk of failure, right? By sort of leveraging their authority and also sort of denying other folks to get to risk something too, right? I'll leave it there. Thanks, guys.